Hello and welcome to Byjus Exam Prep. Welcome to the Daily Hindu Analysis. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our official Telegram channel by scanning the QR code for regular updates on current affairs. So with this, let's get started with today's analysis by looking at an important article from page number 8 of the Delhi edition. This article examines in detail the draft data protection bill that has been brought out by the government, which is likely to be introduced in the parliament in the upcoming budget session of 2023. So first, let's begin our discussion by starting with the basics and by understanding what is personal data and why personal data has to be protected. See, personal data is any information through which the identity of the individual behind the data can be identified. In today's digital age, data has become the new gold or the new oil, and it is said to be powering the fourth stage of the industrial revolution. So tech companies, social media firms, and even governments are interested in monetizing data and in utilizing data for various economic and strategic reasons, thus making data not just an economic priority but also a geopolitical priority. Today, both in the online world and as well as in the offline world, we users contribute a lot of data which is harvested, collected, processed, transferred, and stored by private organizations and as well as by government entities. But if such data can be attributed to personal characteristics and identity and trait of an individual, and in turn, if these pieces of data help us in identifying the individual behind the data, then such data constitutes personal data. This could include your financial data, biometric information, data regarding your choices, personal beliefs, including your religious and political beliefs, and also intimate personal digital data that includes name, age, gender, sexual orientation, your location data, physical and biometric attributes, your health-related information, your online identifiers such as IP address of the devices through which you're connecting to the internet, the identification number of your personal documents, and your economic, cultural, and social attributes. All of this constitutes personal data as defined by the European Union under its GDPR or the General Data Protection Regulation, which has become a model law with regard to personal data protection. So all this information and attributes related to a person or an individual constitutes personal data and can be clearly distinguished from non-personal data, which has been either made anonymous or through which the person or the identity of the individual behind the data cannot be traced or identified. Now, since such personal data is very intimate and private, it has to be safeguarded and protected as a part of your right to privacy. Along with this, there is a need to protect personal data because if this sensitive data falls into the wrong hands, it could make the individual vulnerable to cyber attacks that could compromise the individual's digital security and economic security and could also threaten the very identity of the individual. So in this context, protecting personal data becomes a priority for any government, and in India as well, the government has been striving to introduce a personal data protection law, especially after the Supreme Court declared right to privacy as a constitutional fundamental right and linked this right with Article 21 in the landmark K.S. Puttaswamy case. It further pushed the government to act in this regard, and in 2017 the government established the Justice B.N. Sri Krishna Committee, which was mandated to provide recommendations for a data protection legal framework in the country. So accordingly, the Justice B.N. Sri Krishna Committee submitted a report in 2018 which constituted the first data protection framework in India. Based on this, the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology brought out the Personal Data Protection Bill of 2019 and introduced it in the Parliament. This bill immediately generated a lot of controversy and was referred to a joint parliamentary committee for a thorough review. After nearly 2 years of deliberation, the joint parliamentary committee finally submitted its report and suggested a new draft bill by recommending several amendments to the draft bill that was introduced by the government. Following this, the government decided to withdraw the bill recently in August 2022, as the parliamentary committee had suggested numerous amendments, and hence the government thought that instead of amending the bill and introducing it again, it decided it was better to withdraw the bill entirely and bring out a new bill in its place. So in this context, it becomes important to take a look at the recommendations of the Justice B. N. Srikrishna Committee and what provisions were included in the Personal Data Protection Bill of 2019 that was earlier tabled by the government in the Parliament. This bill, based on the recommendations of Justice B. N. Srikrishna Committee, identified two important categories, that is data principals and data fiduciaries. Data principals would essentially refer to the users or citizens who contribute to their data to private firms and to the government agencies. And accordingly, they were provided with a set of rights to protect their personal data. Data fiduciaries would constitute those organizations, agencies, and institutions which would collect data from the data principals and would be involved in transferring, processing, handling, and storing of this data. These data fiduciaries could be from the private sector, they could also be government agencies as well. So the data fiduciaries were placed under few obligations in order to ensure that the rights of data principals was upheld. And as recommended by the B. N. Srikrishna Committee, it introduced important rights such as right to consent. It essentially meant that data fiduciaries had to obtain the explicit consent of the data principals before they could collect or transfer or process or store data, which essentially constituted the right to informed consent. It basically meant that the users or citizens should know why their data is being collected and for what purpose is it being used. So this essentially meant that data fiduciaries will have to abide by certain principles with regard to data collection and clearly define the purpose of data collection, and also have transparent measures with regard to transfer, processing, handling, and storage of personal data. Based on this, a set of data security safeguards were prescribed, which would have to be followed by the data fiduciaries to uphold data protection. And the fiduciaries would also be obligated to put in place a grievance redressal mechanism to provide an opportunity for the data principals to raise their grievances and complaints. It would also accord the data principals the right to obtain information on how their personal data is being used and processed. And the data fiduciaries were also mandated to provide the right to be forgotten to data principals, so that the data principals could request the data fiduciaries to completely erase all the data held on them in case they choose to opt out of a service or in case they seek correction of any inaccurate data. It would also give the data principals the right to withdraw their consent as well, along with laying down regulations for the social media firms which act as intermediaries, and also mandating regulations for cross-border transfer of data and pushing social media firms and tech companies to focus on data localization, through which they would store, process, and handle Indian data through data centers located within Indian territory. It also proposed the establishment of a National Data Protection Authority in order to address any matter or issue related to data privacy and personal data protection. But this bill became highly controversial despite its salient features, primarily because the government deviated from the recommendations of the Justice B. N. Srikrishna Committee. While the government sought to impose these obligations on private data fiduciaries, the government gave itself a set of broad exceptions to certain government agencies, especially in the security sector. In the draft bill that was introduced by the government, security and law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies were given broad exceptions with regard to personal data protection, and these obligations wouldn't apply on these institutions. The bill also proposed a diluted version of the Data Protection Authority, which would weaken its independence. And while it placed strict obligations on private companies and social media firms, it seemed to let off government agencies, especially law enforcement, intelligence, and security agencies. So on these grounds, the draft Data Protection Bill became highly controversial, and as a result, it was referred to a joint parliamentary committee for further review. But considering the number of amendments that were suggested by the joint parliamentary committee, the government thought it was better to withdraw the bill entirely and bring out a new draft bill in its place. See, the primary challenge with the previous framework was that the Personal Data Protection Bill and as well as the IT rules were seen to be grossly inadequate to protect personal data. Even though the Supreme Court had upheld right to privacy as a constitutional fundamental right, the Personal Data Protection Bill and even the IT rules were still treating personal data as just a statutory right. So thus, the government was giving itself wide sweeping exemptions while seeking to enforce obligations only on the private sector. The withdrawn Data Protection Bill was also criticized for having a very limited understanding of what sort of personal data has to be protected, and experts had even pointed out that very limited penalties had been placed on the violators, with very few obligations to be followed by the data fiduciaries. These obligations that we discussed earlier could be easily overridden by the data fiduciaries by just entering into a contract with the data principals. And even those found to be in violation of these obligations would face very minimal penalties and consequences. Even though it did provide for the concept of right to consent and introduced a lot of safeguards with regard to usage of personal data and categorized personal data into general, sensitive and critical categories, it was grossly insufficient as the government was giving itself a lot of exemptions while placing unnecessary regulations on the private sector. Along with this, the penalties for violations was seen as very minimal, thus triggering the controversy against the Data Protection Bill, which eventually pushed the government to withdraw the bill itself. So now the government has made a fresh attempt to bring out a new draft Digital Personal Data Protection Bill 2022, which is likely to be introduced in the upcoming budget session of 2023. This bill will cover the collection and processing of all forms of personal data that is carried out digitally. So by restricting itself to digital data, the bill is excluding the data which is collected and processed offline, which seems to be a limitation in itself as compared to the previous bill. The previous bill was dealing with all forms of personal data, whether it was collected online or offline. But now the government is restricting the bill to just digital data collected through online platforms and processed online, thus excluding offline data from its purview. So essentially, data which is collected offline and data that is processed manually without making use of digital tools won't be covered under this bill. So critics are pointing out that this in itself is a limitation, as it would again exclude a number of government agencies from the provisions of this law. Next, if you look at the territorial extent of the law, the new draft bill covers the processing of personal data which is collected by data fiduciaries which are operating within the territory of India and which is processed to offer goods and services within India. So this would essentially exclude those data fiduciaries which collect and process data outside of India, and would also exclude data principals who are not located in India. So experts are pointing out that this limited territorial application would again affect the rights of data principals, as it would leave out non-resident Indians and data being processed by data fiduciaries outside of India, and could also adversely affect Indian startups, which often operate overseas as well while they offer their services to foreign clients. So with regard to its scope, the draft Digital Personal Data Protection Bill seeks to cover online data with a limited territorial application. So in this regard, concerns have again been raised by experts, and they fear that this could hamper the principles of data protection. Because see, the very core essence of personal data protection lies in the fact that data principals should be seen as the owners of data, and they should be given maximum control over their own data. So to ensure this, data principals would need notice from the data fiduciaries at every stage of data collection and processing, so that the principals can exercise complete control over the data and how it is being collected, stored and used. When such complete rights are given to data principals over their data, even in certain circumstances where their data has been collected without their explicit consent, the data principals will still have the right to get the data corrected or deleted and always have access to it so that the data principals know as to what is being done with their data. And also the core focus of any data protection law should be on three limitations. These limitations essentially apply for the data fiduciaries and includes collection limitation, so that data fiduciaries will collect such data which is only required to fulfill the purpose of processing. Data fiduciaries should also be subjected to purpose limitation, so that they process only that data which is stated for the required purpose which has been approved by the data principals, and should also apply storage limitation on the data fiduciaries to ensure that only such data is retained for a stated period by the data fiduciaries over which the data principals are supposed to have full control. So these are some of the core tenets of any personal data protection law, and honestly, the European Union's GDPR is considered as one of the most progressive pieces of legislation in this regard. But now, if you compare this with the provisions of the new draft Digital Personal Data Protection Bill 2022, you can notice a number of glaring discrepancies. For example, in the current draft, the explicit reference to certain data protection principles, such as collection limitation, has been entirely removed. The provision of collection limitation would have ensured that a data fiduciary can collect only such data from the data principal to which the data principal has given explicit consent. Now, this removal would allow the data fiduciary to collect personal data even without explicit consent from data principals in certain cases. Also, the draft law is ignoring the fact that in many cases, data principals, even though they might provide their consent for data collection and processing, they may not be entirely aware of the consequences and the manner in which the data would be used by the data fiduciaries. The other problem is that the draft bill has entirely done away with the concept of sensitive personal data. Usually, data related to health, biometrics, genetic data, etc., should be treated as sensitive personal data, as any misuse of this data can have very serious consequences for the data principal. But this distinction has been entirely removed in the draft bill, thus making sensitive personal data more vulnerable to manipulation and abuse by data fiduciaries. Next, the bill is also reducing the information that a data fiduciary is required to provide to the data principal. The data principal should be provided a notice by the data fiduciary only once, that is, while they are collecting the information at the start. But once they obtain the initial consent, later, data fiduciaries have no obligation to give any notice to data principals while they are transferring the data, processing and storing it, or even changing the purpose of data collection. And this directly affects the awareness and knowledge of the data principals with regard to how their data is being used by the data fiduciaries. This, according to experts, is a limited understanding of the purpose of notice. Proponents of personal data protection argue that notice should be provided to data principals at all stages, not just while collecting the data, just to obtain the consent of data principals. If data principals have to freely exercise all the rights, including the right to be forgotten, the right to access their data, correct it, and to essentially have complete control over their data, then subsequent notices have to be given by data fiduciaries to keep the data principals in the loop. But the bill is doing away with this provision, and by limiting the notice to be given by data fiduciaries to data principals, the bill is essentially giving more control to data fiduciaries that could end up compromising the rights of data principals. Then finally, the last drawback is that it introduces the concept of deemed consent, where the data fiduciaries can deem to have obtained consent under certain circumstances without obtaining explicit consent from the data principals. In certain circumstances, data fiduciaries have been exempted from obtaining explicit consent by assuming that they have already obtained deemed consent. And this is especially of concern when the government agencies especially can collect process data in the name of public interest and national security. So if these vague provisions are clubbed with the concept of deemed consent, then data fiduciaries can claim to have obtained deemed consent from the data principals based on a previous consent granted by the data principals. But the one progressive provision which has been praised in the draft bill is that it provides the right to post-mortem privacy. That is, even after an individual dies, he or she can retain control over their data by nominating another individual to act on their behalf while providing consent. This provision was missing in the previous data protection bill, which was withdrawn, but the introduction of right to postmortem privacy is seen as a right step in empowering data principals to exercise greater control over their data. Now let's take up another important column from page number 6 that deals with the welfare of refugees in India, especially the welfare of women refugees in India. This column is written by the Chief of Mission of UNHCR, or the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in India and the Maldives. This column has been brought out by the UNHCR on the account of 16 days of activism which is being marked currently by the United Nations. This is a global movement against gender-based violence that was started in the year 1991 by the Center for Women's Global Leadership and Feminists around the world during the first Women's Global Leadership Institute. And since then, the initiative has been backed by United Nations and its agencies such as UN Women, UNHCR, and the others. It has become an annual movement which is marked for 16 days from 25th of November, which marks the International Day Against Violence Against Women, and it is celebrated till the 10th of December, which marks the International Human Rights Day. This 16-day movement, which is marked annually, is referred to as 16 Days of Activism, which essentially calls upon governments and all the stakeholders to take a stand against gender-based violence. So this year, the article brought out by UNHCR in the Hindu acquires all the more importance because women refugees are facing the disproportionate burden of conflicts which are going on currently in the world. Be it the recent military coup in Myanmar and the clashes which have been going on, or the recent Taliban takeover in Afghanistan and how the Taliban has been targeting women, including young school-going girls, in its pursuit of enforcing the Sharia. And also if you look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the conflict that has followed, in all these conflicts and distress situations, it is often women and girl refugees who often bear the disproportionate burden of being at the receiving end of gender-based violence. Even if you look at other distress situations, such as domestic violence and domestic abuse, sex trafficking and human trafficking, even in these instances, it is women and girls who bear the disproportionate burden of being affected by gender-based violence. This is not just a reflection of patriarchal attitudes in our society, but also a reflection of general neglect of women-related issues with regard to governance and welfare. Now, if we examine this issue just in the context of refugees and India, you will notice that India is home to lakhs of refugees whom we have received over the decades. Be it the large-scale inflow of Tibetan refugees from China in the 1950s, or the inflow of Tamil refugees from Sri Lanka from 1950s to almost 2009, and also the flow of Bengali refugees from East Pakistan, particularly in 1970s. We have received a constant stream of refugees into our country from our neighbours. Ethnic conflicts, communal tensions, and oppression in these countries have pushed refugees into India, and we have seen the same continuing from Afghanistan, Myanmar, and other countries as well. So today, India is home to lakhs of refugees who are settled in various refugee camps, some of whom have been officially recognized by the Indian government, whereas some of them have just been recognized by the UNHCR without any official recognition from India. So now, the writer's argument is that amongst the refugees, a significant percentage of them happen to be women, and it is essential for India to focus on their socio-economic welfare as well. The writer is urging India to pay more attention to the welfare of women refugees in the country, and also expresses optimism on this front as India already has a credible record with regard to promoting women empowerment and women welfare. For example, India was one amongst the first democracies in the world to push for universal adult franchise right after its independence and ensured that women got the right to vote as well when it wasn't even available in many developed democracies. Later, in 1950, when India adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights along with other UN members, India played an instrumental role in displaying gender sensitivity with regard to such an important international treaty by changing the language from all men to all human beings, thus reflecting India's leadership role in displaying gender sensitivity and gender balance. Since then, India has ratified and become part of key conventions related to women empowerment, including the CEDAW Convention of UN, which stands for the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. India has also been a part of Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action and has been working with global stakeholders to tackle women-related issues. Indian society in general has made tremendous progress over the years across various indicators, and women in India have made tremendous progress across fields including politics, business, sports, etc. Today you see that Indian women are playing a pivotal role in key family decisions. They are seen to be enjoying greater reproductive rights, greater control over their body, along with land rights and livelihood and economic rights. In the armed forces as well, women have overcome the glass ceiling and have not just been serving as commanders, but have also been recruited into combat duty. Even if you look at the UN peacekeeping forces, women soldiers from India have made a stellar contribution, as India has made the largest contribution of women forces to UN peacekeeping missions. Domestically as well, you see sincere efforts being made by the center and state governments through various socio-economic welfare schemes and policies, including the Janani Suraksha Yojana, Beti Bachao Beti Padhao Andolan, and even in schemes related to education, livelihood, etc., women and girls have been given special priority along with focus on their health and nutritional indicators. The Nari Shakti for New India campaign clearly represents the aspirations of millions of women in the country, and the government has been backing these initiatives to promote overall socio-economic welfare of women, and the writer is only hoping that the benefits of this reaches women refugees as well, who represent a marginalized section in the country. This argument being made by the writer is very important because out of the 2 lakh plus refugees who are sheltered in India, nearly half of them are women and girls, and they face a very high degree of deprivation considering their unique socio-economic and political circumstances. India has given official recognition to a section of refugees, such as the refugees we have received from Sri Lanka. In such cases, India has given official documentation to them, including Aadhaar card, PAN cards, etc., which makes them eligible to access the benefits of various welfare programs that further promotes their economic and financial inclusion. Such official recognition and documentation of refugees, especially women refugees, allows them to fully participate in the Indian economy and contribute to it, and also to draw the benefits of various national welfare schemes that are focused on women. But however, a large section of refugees who are not officially recognized by India, such as refugees from Afghanistan, Myanmar, etc., they have only been registered by the UNHCR office in Delhi, and they have very limited protection and access to services. And as a result, they are being left behind with regard to their socio-economic development. It is this issue in particular that the writer is highlighting and hopes that India will act on this front to ensure that women refugees will be eligible for all national welfare schemes and policies, not just to protect and empower these vulnerable women, but also to ensure that India fully aligns with its international and constitutional commitments. Next, on page number 10, we have an article related to India-Qatar relations as a result of a recent development which has posed a challenge to the relationship. Recently, 8 former Indian Navy personnel have been arrested by Qatar, and apparently they have been held in solitary confinement on the charges of spying and espionage, which is yet to be officially acknowledged either by the Qatar government or by Indian officials. According to several reports, these former Navy personnel of the Indian Navy, they were working for a Qatar-based defense company, Dara Global Technologies and Consultancy Services, which is involved in training armed forces, especially the Qatar Navy. The managing director of this firm, who happens to be a former commander of the Indian Navy, was even awarded the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman in 2019 by India in recognition of his contribution for India-Qatar relations. But in a shocking development, this commander, along with 7 other personnel, have been arrested by Qatari intelligence, and reports are indicating that Qatar suspects them of spying against the Qatar government on behalf of Israel. While these reports have not been confirmed either by India or Qatar, definitely diplomatic efforts are underway to ensure the immediate release of these Indian workers, as the issue is putting a strain on the friendly relations between India and Qatar. It's also important to note that India's Vice President, Jagdeep Dhankar, has landed in Qatar as part of the inauguration of the FIFA World Cup, which has gotten underway, and it gives us an opportunity to take a look at India-Qatar relations. So the two countries established diplomatic relations in 1973, and since then both the sides have enjoyed very close relations. There have been frequent high-level visits, including visits by prime ministers, presidents, the Crown Prince of Qatar, foreign ministers and defense ministers. And especially in the last 15 years, the relations have become strategic between the two countries. The two sides share a very close economic partnership, and especially for India, Qatar is very, very critical for its energy security. The total bilateral trade volume stands at around $9 billion as of 2020-21, with India importing a number of energy products from Qatar amounting to nearly $8 billion. From Qatar, India mainly procures LNG, LPG, chemicals, petrochemical products, and Qatar is one of the largest suppliers of LNG to India and accounts for more than 50% of India's global LNG imports. There are other petrochemical products as well that India imports from Qatar, thus making Qatar a key partner for India. And as India is a significant buyer, India becomes an important destination market for Qatar as well. There are several key exports from India to Qatar, including cereals, vegetables, fruits and spices, and as well as engineering equipment. And the important point is that India is among the top 3 export destinations for Qatar after Japan and South Korea, and also one of the top 3 sources of Qatar's imports following China and Japan. So it's very clear that India-Qatar share a very close economic partnership that is rooted in their energy relations. And Qatar, which is a small West Asian country located over here in the Persian Gulf, also happens to be a strategic partner for India as a result of close defense relations, as they both have common strategic and security priorities in the Persian Gulf and in the Arabian Sea. India plays a key role in training Qatar's armed forces, as their personnel have been provided reserved slots in our defense training institutions. The two countries have even signed a maritime defense agreement in 2008, and both closely collaborate in counterterrorism, tackling extremism, and as well as in dealing with piracy, maritime security, etc. In fact, it's not just the armed forces of the two countries which work closely. Even the intelligence agencies of both the sides have a very close working relationship. Recently, Indian Navy and the Qatari Navy have started a joint naval exercise known as Zair al-Bahar. Both sides also share very close cultural relations as well, as there is a very strong Indian community in Qatar. According to latest data, more than 7 lakh Indian nationals reside and work in Qatar, and this number is expected to reach 1 million workers very soon. Indian workers play a key role in Qatar's economy, and they work in various key sectors including education, banking, information technology, health, hospitality, construction, etc. While a number of Indian professionals work in Qatar, the country is also a very big destination for migrant workers from India who travel in large numbers, and Indian workers in particular have made an immense contribution to Qatar's preparation for the FIFA World Cup. Of late, Qatar has been targeted with human rights violation allegations by Western countries, as a number of migrant laborers have lost their lives while working on key projects related to the FIFA World Cup. So from Western media and Western governments, Qatar has been facing a lot of criticism, while Qatar denies this as a Western propaganda. But the fact is that India happens to be one of the biggest contributor of migrant workers who work in construction and real estate industry, and more than 7,000 workers have died in Qatar in the last few years, and nearly 2,700 of them are Indian workers, according to data from the Indian Embassy. So despite such close relations, and despite India having such leverage against Qatar, Qatar has taken an unprecedented step in arresting and detaining former Indian Navy personnel on charges of espionage. And while there is no official confirmation from both the sides on the charges being faced by these men, Qatar has permitted India to provide consular access to these men who have been placed under solitary confinement, and there is increasing pressure on both the sides to work towards the release of these arrested men. Now, coming to the last article for today, India's former Foreign Secretary, Harshvardhan Shringla, has pointed out that India has given more than $15 billion as concessional soft loans to its neighboring countries, which has been primarily invested to strengthen infrastructure in our neighboring countries and to improve their connectivity with India. See, India happens to be a major provider of development assistance through its foreign policy. And India not only provides economic aid to countries in distress, but also offers concessional loans or soft loans, known as line of credit, which provides for low interest rates and easy repayment schedules, and has been assisting the neighboring countries in particular to address key developmental challenges in our neighborhood. Amongst the neighboring countries, Bhutan is often the top recipient of Indian assistance, followed by Nepal, Afghanistan, Seychelles, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Maldives. In the 2021 budget alone, India had set aside 7,100 crore rupees for development assistance to various friendly partners, and a majority of it was channeled towards our neighboring countries. India has not just been helping countries like Bhutan, Nepal, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh, but has even provided immense assistance to Sri Lanka and Maldives, and even to faraway countries in Africa, South America, and in the Pacific region. India has continued this approach in the 2022 budget as well, in line with its principle of neighborhood first policy, and a large part of the Indian assistance towards Nepal is focused on helping Nepal strengthen its armed forces by modernizing the training and equipment, and has also offered a lot of soft loans to strengthen infrastructure and connectivity projects in Nepal. This includes the construction of a motorable bridge over the Mahakali River, which is a transboundary river between India and Nepal, and similar humanitarian and developmental projects have been taken up by India and Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, over the last 20 years, India has invested nearly $3 billion in the country to build the Afghan parliament, to construct important highways, and as well as to construct the Salma hydropower dam. India has even funded the construction of hospitals, schools, and has even supplied life-saving medicines and vaccines to the country. Bhutan, which happens to be the largest recipient of Indian assistance amongst the neighboring countries, has seen a complete transformation of its economy thanks to India's economic assistance. Through India's developmental assistance, Bhutan has successfully executed multiple hydropower projects, which today is fetching revenue to Bhutan as a result of electricity exports, and today Bhutan has one of the highest per capita incomes in South Asia. Similarly, India has funded development projects in Myanmar, especially to help out the Rakhine region, which has been hit by ethnic conflict, and also to protect India's economic and strategic interests in the Rakhine region. India has assisted Bangladesh as well to develop key connectivity infrastructure to link the northeast of India closely with Bangladesh by funding several road, railway, shipping, and port projects. Along with this, India has prioritized training and capacity building, not just for Bangladesh but even several other developing and small countries, through its ITEC program or the Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation, through which India offers training programs and scholarships to friendly nations. So this is just an illustration of the kind of development assistance India offers, not just to its neighboring countries, but also to other friendly countries in Africa, Latin America, and in the Pacific. Now let's take a look at the mains practice questions. The first question: India lacks an effective personal data protection legal framework despite being a top data contributing nation. In this light, critically examine the recent developments. The second question: women refugees always bear a disproportionate burden in any conflict or distress situation. Evaluate the status of refugees in India and what can be done to promote the welfare of women refugees in particular. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, which has been provided in the description box below. With this, I would like to conclude my discussion, and if you found it to be beneficial, do let us know by liking the video, share the video with other aspirants, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.